Hi, I'm Avi. Welcome to Chapter 2 of Mice and Men. We're going to do a little analysis today and see if we can uncover some of the deeper meanings in this text. At the start of Chapter 2, George and Lenny arrive at the ranch where they will be working. An old man named Candy, who is missing a hand, shows them to their lodgings. The bunkhouse where all the laborers stay, Steinbeck says, is a long rectangular building with 8 bunks consisting of straw beds and wall-mounted apple crates for storing possessions. The room has a stove and a card table. It's about 10 a.m. and Candy tells George and Lenny that the boss was expecting them last night. The boss, Candy says, was sore as hell about the fact that they weren't present and ready to work earlier in the morning. We can anticipate that Candy will soon become George and Lenny's closest ally on the farm. Just from this reading alone, it's clear that he wants to help them, wants to look out for them, and to warn them about any trouble that might be coming, no matter how large or small the trouble might be. Next, George sees a yellow can of insect poison above his bunk and asks Candy whether the beds are full of lice. Candy insists that the last man who occupied the bunk was a blacksmith who was positively obsessed with cleanliness and kept the repellent only as a precaution. George remains skeptical, but after inspecting the mattress closely, he decides to unpack his bindle and make up the bed. So here we see George's skepticism about his new surroundings, his new environment. Even though working on the ranch will provide George and Lenny with a needed income, George is still looking for any excuse, it seems this way, to escape and continue wandering in search of something better. As we continue, Candy tells George and Lenny again how angry the boss was, that they didn't arrive in time to start work earlier, and says that the boss took his rage out on all of them, the other laborers, especially the stable buck. George is amazed that even the stable hand, whose job is completely removed from their own, would catch hell for their lateness. But Candy, using a racial slur, and I think we know what it is, informs him that the stable hand is the only black man on the ranch. Candy adds that in spite of the stable hand having a quiet, reserved disposition and a crooked back due to being kicked by a horse long ago, the boss always takes out his rage on him due to his race. So in this story, we never learn the boss's name. He's just referred to as the boss, perhaps anonymizing his violence. This passage that we've just read demonstrates the unforgiving nature of the place in which Lenny and George have found themselves. The boss is shown to be a cruel man who scapegoats the only black laborer on the farm for the other ranch hands' failures. The term stable buck is an offensive racial slur for black stable hand. This is clearly a word that is hostile to minorities and other marginalized people. This foreshadows trouble for George and Lenny too. George and Lenny are outsiders, but they're invisible outsiders because they have the same racial appearance as the other laborers. George asks some more about what kind of guy the boss is. Candy insists he's pretty nice, except for when he's angry, and once even bought the laborers a whole gallon of whiskey to share on Christmas. The men were in such a good mood, Candy says, that they even let the stable hand celebrate with them. But the evening turned calamitous when one of the men began attacking him. Here we see that the atmosphere at the ranch is very eat or be eaten, which you might call dog eat dog. Even though Candy is himself marginalized because he's got just the one hand, he knows he's still better off than the stable hand, who is doubly vulnerable because of his race and his own physical disability. So Crooks, the stable hand, has 2 visible distinctions. Both his race, he presents as African-American, and he has a disability. Next, the bunkhouse door opens, and a little stocky man in jeans, a flannel and high-heeled boots and spurs, which prove he is not a laboring man, enters. George recognizes right away that this man is the boss. The boss steps into the room and demands to see George and Lenny's work slips. He asks why the two of them weren't at the ranch earlier. George explains that the bus driver let them out too early. He says they had to walk over 10 miles to the ranch. The boss asks for George and Lenny's full names. George introduces himself as George Milton and says Lenny's name is Lenny Small. Here, the boss's suspicious attitude towards George and Lenny suggests the level of scrutiny they'll be subjected to while working on the ranch. The boss runs a tight ship and lets nothing slip past him, demanding total control over and submission from his workers. This no-nonsense attitude is sort of emblematic of the dire circumstances the men are facing during the Great Depression. When exhibiting weakness or failing to do your duties could very well lead to destitution or starvation. So any little thing can get you fired, and getting fired could be a death sentence at this time in the United States. The boss asks why Lenny doesn't speak for himself. George insists Lenny isn't a talker, but is strong as a bull. Lenny echoes George and happily says he's strong as a bull. George gives Lenny a look. The boss asks Lenny what he can do as a worker. George answers for him. He says Lenny can do anything the boss needs. The boss asks why George won't let Lenny speak for himself. George replies that Lenny is not bright, but makes up for his lack of mental acuity in physical strength. The boss remains skeptical, demanding to know why George would take so much trouble for another guy. George insists Lenny is his cousin and was kicked in the head by a horse as a child. George says he's been taking care of Lenny since his old lady died. We learn later this is an invention of George's. So this ranch is a microcosm. It's like a smaller version of the landscape of the American West in the midst of the Great Depression. In a dog-eat-dog world where every man is out for himself, the boss is suspicious of two men who actually look out for one another. George has to tread lightly as he navigates the fine line between explaining why he and Lenny need to travel together without making Lenny seem weak or like a liability, something that could harm the ranch rather than help it. So the boss is satisfied by this explanation, but he warns George not to try and pull anything over on him. He says he's got his eyes on both Lenny and George. He orders the men to start work after dinner with Slim's team. Slim, the boss says, is a skinner or mule driver. The boss takes his leave, but not before looking for a long moment, Steinbeck says, at Lenny and George. This passage further emphasizes just how odd it is for two men to look out for one another the way George and Lenny do. So strange as to make them targets of suspicion and maybe even anger from some. After the boss leaves, George chastises Lenny for talking. Lenny apologizes, insisting he forgot to stay quiet. George orders Lenny to remain quiet from now on. Lenny shyly asks George if he was really kicked in the head once, and if they are really cousins. George replies that if he was Lenny's blood kin, he'd shoot himself. Yeah, he really said that. George is growing even more frustrated with Lenny's dependence on him and worried by Lenny's inability to remember the truth of the connection between them. It's clear that although George genuinely cares for Lenny and wants to protect him, he also realizes that putting his friend first may put George himself at risk. So George goes to the front door and opens it. Candy is standing there with an old, blind, and lame sheepdog. George accuses Candy of eavesdropping, listening in on them. Candy insists he wasn't listening in and was just petting his dog. The dog drags himself into the bunkhouse, sits down, and starts licking his coat. George marvels at the dog's rough shape. Candy says that he's had the dog since he was a puppy and that he was a great sheep herder in his prime. Candy and his dog serve as a symbol of the relationship between George and Lenny. Just as Candy can't bring himself to abandon his dog or put the thing out of its misery, George can't find it within himself to separate from Lenny, even though he knows that Lenny is becoming more and more of a liability. The more trouble Lenny gets into, the more trouble George gets into. Next, a young man with sun-browned skin and curly hair comes into the bunkhouse. He has a glove on his left hand and is wearing high-heeled boots, just like the boss. He asks Candy if he has seen his old man, and Candy, addressing the man as Curly, says the boss has gone to the cookhouse. Curly approaches Lenny and asks if he and George are the men the boss has been waiting on. George says they've just arrived, but Curly urges him to let the big guy talk. Lenny quietly echoes George's statement that the two of them have just arrived. Curly warns Lenny to answer when spoken to before storming out. This visit from Curly, the boss's son, echoes the boss's visit just moments before. This ranch is an unforgiving place, and people like Lenny, people who are different, are suspect and liable to be singled out and scrutinized. Next, Candy tells the men that Curly is the boss's son. Candy says that, like a lot of little guys, Curly wants to show dominance over bigger men. Candy says men like Curly never fight fair. If he wins in a fight against a big guy, everyone will talk about how surprisingly strong he is. But if he loses that same fight, everyone will talk about how unfair the advantage was. George says that Curly had better watch himself. Lenny is big and strong and don't know no rules. This passage foreshadows the conflict among Curly, Lenny, and George. Curly seems hungry for a fight. He's pugnacious. And while George wants to protect his and Lenny's new position, he doesn't plan to take any guff from Curly or let Lenny do so either. Remember, George has quite a temper himself. So George and Candy sit down at the card table and begin shuffling up a deck. Candy secretively tells George that Curly has been in rare form lately. He got married a couple weeks ago and has been cockier than ever recently in an attempt to show off for his wife. Curly's wife, Candy whispers, has got the eye. In other words, she's flirtatious and has been making eyes at Slim and a worker named Carlson ever since arriving on the ranch. Candy's gossip about Curly's wife and the unstable relationship between the two of them foreshadows even more calamity on the ranch. It suggests that the weakness of people's underlying insecurities, instability, and suspicion could easily take over the outwardly strong and stoic demeanors that they put forth. Next, Candy stands up and says he's got to ready the wash basins for the men coming from the fields. He asks George to keep their conversation confidential, and George promises that he will. After Candy leaves, George warns Lenny to be careful around Curly. If Curly and Lenny tangle, as he puts it, Lenny and George will both get the boot. They will be fired. Lenny insists he will do whatever it takes to avoid trouble. George reminds Lenny of the plan they made should any trouble arise. Lenny says he remembers that he should go and hide in the bush. This passage continues to foreshadow the burgeoning tension, the growing tension George feels on the ranch. He doesn't want to rock the boat, but is ready for disaster after so many troubles with and because of Lenny. Next, George hears someone calling for the stable hand. When he looks up into the doorway, he sees a beautiful girl in heavy makeup, a house dress, and red shoes standing there. Her hair is curled and her fingernails are painted red. She says she's looking for Curly. George demurely tells her, without looking directly at her, that Curly just left the bunkhouse a minute ago. When Slim comes by, Curly's wife greets him flirtatiously and says she's trying to find Curly. Slim says she isn't trying very hard. He's just seen the man go into the ranch house. Curly's wife bids the laborers goodbye and scurries away. Here, the introduction of Curly's wife shows that Candy's earlier warnings were true. It seems that she is clearly looking to stir up trouble, or at least get herself some attention, without any consideration for what her actions might mean for the men with whom she's toying. After she's gone, George calls Curly's wife a tramp, but Lenny insists she's purty. George warns Lenny never to say anything like that again. Lenny begs George to let the two of them leave, stating he has a bad feeling about the ranch. George insists they should stay until they get a stake in the property, but admits he himself would like to leave. George, spooked by Lenny's having gotten them in trouble with a woman in the last town, is worried the same will happen here, of course. Lenny also seems worried about the potential for disaster, but George knows if they pick up and move again, they'll be even further from achieving their dream of stability. Next, Slim enters the bunkhouse. He is a grave, strong man with an ageless face, Steinbeck says. He sits down across the card table from George, who is lazily playing solitaire. He asks George if he and Lenny are the new guys and whether they travel around together. George says they do. He must take care of the slow Lenny. Slim says not many guys travel around together and laments that everybody in the whole damn world is scared of each other. Slim, like the boss, is surprised by George and Lenny's friendship and mutual care for one another. But rather than expressing suspicion, he expresses something like envy. This suggests that despite, or maybe because of, the rough environment of itinerant laborers' lives in the American West, many men are looking for companionship despite their initial skepticism and reservations toward trusting others. This is another representation of loneliness in this story, isn't it? Next, a large man with a big stomach comes into the bunkhouse. Slim introduces him to George and Lenny as Carlson. Carlson asks Slim whether his dog had her litter of puppies yet, and Slim says she gave birth last night. 9 puppies were born, he says, though he drowned 4 of them for fear she wouldn't be able to feed them all. Carlson says that Slim should do Candy a favor and shoot his lame, smelly old dog, and then give him one of the new puppies to raise. Before Slim can answer him, the dinner bell rings, and Slim and Carlson hurry to leave the bunkhouse. The potential for Slim's dog's new puppies to replace Candy's old lame dog mirrors George's underlying forbidden desire to rid himself of Lenny and focus only on prospering himself. If we think about the violence inherent in the drowning of these puppies, the proximity of water, there is still more foreshadowing to the tragic end of this story. Lenny excitedly asks George if he heard the men talking about puppies, and if George can ask Slim to give Lenny a brown and white puppy. George tries to calm Lenny down by urging him to hurry and wash up for dinner. Curly enters the bunkhouse again and demands to know whether the men have seen his wife. George says she was just at the bunkhouse looking for Curly. Curly asks which way she went, and George replies that he doesn't know because he didn't watch her go. Curly hurries out the door. Just like Curly's wife seems to be looking in on the men as a provocation, Curly's demands of the men to know whether they've seen his wife seems like a deliberate trap. George knows how to handle the situation calmly and coolly, for now. George and Lenny leave the bunkhouse as George confides in Lenny that he himself is worried about tangling with Curly someday. Candy's dog remains in the bunkhouse alone, raising its head for a moment when it senses someone at the door again. It is Curly, who pops his head in quickly before jerking out again. Candy's dog senses trouble, but it can't directly look it in the face. Just as Lenny knows something is wrong on the ranch, but is uncertain of what it is and unprepared for how to avoid trouble. Okay, I hope that you have enjoyed this analysis of chapter 2. I hope that it has been helpful for your understanding of the reading, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts about it in the near future. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.